don't know what that means. Okay, we thought it would be a good thing to do to have a kind of discussion about Marx's method, which is quite a difficult thing to do, especially in a short period. But partly because it's important anyway, but partly because at the moment it's so fashionable for there to be this idea that any grand theory, any attempt at explaining the way the world works, they call it grand narrative in universities, is just wrong, you know, and shouldn't even be attempted. I mean, this is so true that it's actually, it's part, funnily enough, of kind of mainstream official ideology that, you know, you can't really understand the world as a whole, that basically, as Thatcher put it, you just have to accept the workings of the market and there is no alternative. I mean, even to the extent that sometimes it gets to the stage where there's an analogy that's introduced between trying to understand the world in its totality and being totalitarian. That somehow, if you try and understand, if you try and create a big theory, what you're going to do is to create a kind of dictatorship. You know, this is the extent to which this idea works. And unfortunately, I was just talking to John about this earlier, actually, and he was saying that to some extent these ideas are taken up by the parts of the left. That, you know, you shouldn't try and understand the world, that theory is something that's a little bit dodgy in some way, and that the thing is to struggle, and that, you know, I mean, the important thing is just to struggle over particular issues and kind of see what happens. So I do think this is an important argument to take up, and I mean, it's ironic that there is this argument out there that you know, a big understanding, a global understanding of the world is not possible or is backward in some way. When, if you think about it, the capitalist system kind of encompasses the globe more systematically, more fundamentally than it's ever done in the past. Every society in the whole world is shaped by corporate power, by exploitation, by big business in a way that, you know, infinitely more so than it was in Marx's day. So it's ironic. It's also ridiculous, actually, if you step back and think about it. I mean, the idea that you can seriously consider trying to challenge the system, trying to create system change, without having an analysis of how the various bits of the system link up, of how particular cases and particular symptoms are linked to the sort of the drives that run society. I mean, it's absurd. We don't have a chance of changing the world without having that kind of, at least the attempt to try and understand it globally. And worse still, actually, if we don't develop our own theory, if we don't build on the theory of the past to understand the world, what we're going to end up doing is actually adopting other theories. That's the truth. I mean, there isn't the kind of ideological vacuum. What you find is that people start internalising elements of the kind of ruling class ideology. So, Marx and Engels kind of started to develop their understanding of how capitalism works and their method in the 1840s. Funnily enough, at a time when mainstream capitalist ideas were much more advanced than they are now. I mean, it's an indication of how the intellectual decline that we're now at a stage where the capitalists basically say, well, we can't really understand the world. At the time, there were a whole series of attempts to understand the world by economists in Britain, by the Enlightenment in France, by German philosopher Hegel particularly. And Marx and Engels built on these things. They kind of developed on them and they surpassed them. And probably the single most important kind of intellectual breakthrough, which is the foundation of Marxism, was the idea that the way that we can understand the world is not by the ideas that exist in the world, it's not by the way people understand their own societies or their own existence, it's not by thoughts, it's not by culture, it's not by those kind of expressions of things, that actually, and nor is it by the kind of actions of great men, that it's actually the way societies in reality work, the way they're socially and economically organised, that provides the way to understand them and the secret to their operation. And I'll just give a quote from the German ideology. A lot of Marx and Engels is so beautifully written, actually. And I'll give you this quote, which, but unfortunately uses the kind of men for human beings problem that was part of the situation at the time. But in the German ideology, Marx says, we do not set out from what men say, imagine, conceive, nor from men as narrated, thought of or conceived, in order to arrive at men in the flesh. We set out from the real active men, and on their basis of their real life process, we demonstrate the development of their ideological reflexes and echoes of this life process. In other words, what's at the heart of understanding the world is the way societies are organised and the way societies are structured. And not just... hi there. Hi. And when it talks about the real life processes of society, or when they talk about the real life processes of society, what they mean and the way they develop that is really about economic organisation, because their view was, and again this is the sort of core of the breakthrough, is that it's actually labour, it's actually the interaction between human beings and the natural world, and the development of the processes that come out of that shape the way societies are organised in the end of the day. The productive interaction with nature is the basic, as Marx put it, the nature-imposed condition of human existence. And it's the way that you organise your interaction with nature that then develops the way in which human beings relate amongst themselves. That a labour process is the basis of all the other processes that then develop in a society. And this is the kind of the sort of centre point to the sort of jumping off point for the rest of the theoretical development. So there's a kind of famous little aphorism that Marx made, which is crude and simplistic, but gives you a kind of an idea, an insight into what he's saying. He says, the hand mill gives you the society with the feudal lord, the steam mill, society with the industrial capitalist. Now we can argue about whether that's a bit too sort of technological determinist, but nevertheless it gives you the sort of general idea of the approach. So that's the first breakthrough, that's the sort of fundamental breakthrough. I just want to make a few points that kind of flow on from this and that Marx and Engels developed with other people. Just three main sort of propositions, if you like, that I think are a kind of logical development from this starting point. The first sort of concerns the importance of understanding the society, whatever society you're looking at. Obviously, in our case, we're mainly focusing on capitalism. Understanding it as a totality, understanding it as a whole system whose various elements interact on each other, and actually in which the totality itself has an impact on the various different elements. If it's the case that it's the economic organisation of society that shapes the way, that basically shapes the way the rest of society operates, then actually the whole of the other structures that exist on the basis of the economic structure will represent and express the interests of those people who are running the system, running the economic basis itself. So, for example, a point that Marx and Engels made quite a lot of quite early on in the 1840s. The state institutions, which, particularly under capitalism, have the appearance of being kind of independent, neutral, somehow separate from the economic base, you know, the courts, the police, Parliament, the media and so forth. Actually, although they do have this superficial appearance of being independent, in the end of the day, they systematically protect and defend the interests of the people that run the economic base. So in this sense, you get a situation where you can see how the whole of society sort of reflects or reproduces the structures that are embedded at the economic level. And again, think about the situation now. And it seems to me that the colonisation of every aspect of society thanks Sam, the colonisation of every aspect of society by the kind of prevailing economic models, if you like, has never been clearer. I mean, it's always been the case, I think, that the courts have defended the establishment and the media has reflected the values of the status quo. But now it's like, it's so obvious, it's so in your face. You get like corruption in Parliament, you get the media being directly run by massive multinational corporations. You get the police involved in those operations. I mean, the whole media scam, the whole Murdoch scam, was a fantastic example of the way these different institutions actually converge around corporate power. So it seems to me that that particular insight is hugely confirmed by the kind of developments of neoliberalism and so forth that we've been talking about. Now, this is very important because there's a very practical conclusion from all this. If it is the case that all the institutions of society, however they may superficially seem to operate, at a deep level are reflecting and defending the interests of those in power economically, it means that a kind of reformist project, that a sort of attempt to get into those institutions and convert them from within won't work. And this is really the reason why Marx was a revolutionary, why he argued, and Engels and the others argued, that actually the conclusion from this must be that we have to have a kind of root and branch overthrow of all the institutions in society if we want to deal with economic inequality in the first place. Point two, that's this sort of vague discussion of totality. Point two is to do with contradictions or divisions within the system, because while at the one, there's the stress on understanding the totality of the system, it's also the case that, with the exception of kind of pre-class societies, and hopefully with the exception of a future socialist society, all class societies are deeply, in fact all societies historically up to now, including the present one, are deeply divided. They have contradictions right at the heart of them. And capitalism is more divided and more deeply conflicted than any previous society, whereas the kind of, the feudal barons exploited the peasants brutally. The kind of limits of their exploitation was their stomachs and the kind of the consumption of them and their retinue. That's essentially why they stole from the peasantry, in order to, provide their own elite lifestyle at the time. Capitalism is different. Capitalism, accumulation and exploitation, is based on an endless and infinite competition for profit, the competition for accumulation, and therefore there's no limits to exploitation. It's a system that constantly tries to increase the level and the extent of exploitation. So you have a situation now where, as we know, that almost unthinkable as well as obscene levels of inequality, where the 50 richest people in the world now own as much as the annual earnings of half the world's population. It's an inequality that is hard to even begin to grasp. And it's an inevitable product of the way the society works. But of course, the other side of this division at the heart of the totality of capitalism is that it also provides the possibility of change. And the class struggle was the central element of Marx's understanding of the way change could happen. Because, as he said, there is this sort of fundamental divide which is rooted in the very basis of the system, which is that those who produce under capitalism don't own anything, and those that own everything don't actually do any work. They don't produce anything. So there's this fundamental division between the owners, the tiny minority, and the mass of the population who are working. And it's this division that gave Marx saw as the kind of potential for real change. The working class has a privileged position in Marx's view of the world, partly because workers have the capacity to inflict serious defeats. They're a class that has the capacity to bring profit-making, bring exploitation to a halt by going on strike, by taking over occupations, and by mass movements in general. But partly as well for another reason, that actually the working class is a class that has no interest in exploiting any other section or oppressing any others, no possibility of exploiting any other section of society, and no interest in oppressing any other part of society. It is in the interests of working people, although we don't always realise it, to unite the biggest possible coalition and alliance on our side against those that exploit workers. And this means, thirdly, actually, the third reason why workers are privileged or have a privileged point of view in capitalism, paradoxically, is because it's only the working class that has an interest in fully understanding the way the world works. It's only really from the point of view of the working class that we get a kind of the possibility of a total critique of the way society works, because precisely for the reasons that I say, that actually we need to understand the world, root and branch, whereas the ruling class needs to tell lies. The ruling class needs to mythologise. They need to kind of throw as much sand in our eyes as they possibly can to try and conceal what's going on. We, in the end of the day, actually have an interest in trying to clarify the situation and to try and understand the way that the system works as a totality. So my third and last point is kind of tying those two things together, because, and it's about change, and it's about how Marxism conceives of the revolutionary process. And this actually involves kind of combining the sense of totality and the sense of contradiction and developing an understanding of how they work. And in fact, totality, contradiction and change are really the three elements. They're a kind of way of summarising the three elements of the dialectical method which Marx used to try and understand the world. Because because one of the big kind of criticisms made of Marxism, one of the big slurs against Marxism, which is made by the mainstream, is that it's deterministic, that Marx talked about a sense of inevitable change in society, that the contradictions would work themselves out in such a way that the great day will just come, and there's this moment where the system collapses. Actually, I mean, this is ironic again, because in fact it's the capitalist boosters who really are deterministic. I mean, they're the ones talking about the end of history. They're the ones talking about, we just have to fall back and rely on the kind of workings of the market. And actually what they don't like about Marx is precisely the opposite, is precisely that Marx was arguing for a society in which human beings would in fact start to take control of the world in which they lived, and that human beings would actually create a society of real freedom by taking control consciously of the society in which we live. And the extent to which this is true is proved by the fact that Marx talked about the end of capitalism, when it came, being the beginning of history. As far as he was concerned, history hadn't really started, or won't really start, until human beings actually begin to take control of society collectively. So, on the question of inevitability, Marxists talk about the contradictions in the economic system and the way in which these contradictions throw up struggle and throw up conflict and throw up, to some extent, an insight into the way the society works. But this doesn't inevitably lead to change. It's not enough on its own just to rely. For example, in the economic crisis, there's no question people have talked about it. It's created a radicalisation, it's created a sense of understanding of elements of the way the system works. But in itself, it hasn't created a movement that is capable or on a mass scale committed to transforming society. Unless these insights that do arise from existence and from the experience under capitalism are united, are brought together into a conscious strategy, and a strategy that is about deepening the central contradictions that exist, then the opportunity can pass us by. And we've seen in this country that, we've had, 5 years of a deep economic crisis, the deepest crisis has been for decades, probably since the 1930s. It hasn't automatically led to wave after wave of strikes and massive opposition. It's led to a radicalisation. It's led to the potential for there to be radical challenge to the system, but in itself, it hasn't brought that about automatically. And if you think about it, there's a logical problem with saying that automatically we're going to be brought towards a situation where people achieve freedom. That's not something that can happen. The process has to be one that's conscious. And the strategy you have does matter. There are a whole lot of contradictions in capitalism. There are whole lots of different conflicts and different struggles that do arise at different times. There are struggles of, the student struggle. There are struggles of oppressed groups of all kinds against racism and sexism and so on and so forth. they're all crucial and they all need to be fully developed, but the central question is whether consciously we can link all these different struggles to the fundamental fault line that has the potential to destabilise the system. And they talk at the same time as saying we can't talk about totality anymore. It's interesting they also talk about we can't talk about the working class anymore. In fact, or that the working class doesn't exist in the same way that it has in the past. In fact, the working class nowadays, just in North Korea, is bigger than the working class was globally at the time when Marx was writing. The potential is there, the conflicts are there, the contradictions in the system are there. The question is, can we use an understanding of the world that we live in order to consciously create a movement that links our struggles with the central fault line in society, that of class? Thanks.